Hi everyone, my name is Stephan Heunis, and this workshop today will be about fMRI data and code sharing. And I would like to start off by thanking the organizers of this event for having me give this workshop. My details are at the bottom of this slide if you want to contact me for whatever reason. So some notes and disclaimers about the content that I'll present today. So firstly, I'm not a psychologist. I'm an engineer, and this whole event is for psychologists. So if I misrepresent your work or your interests at all, please correct me. And you are very welcome to ask questions throughout, or send me questions afterwards. I use a lot of memes, so I hope you like them. And you can also find links to the slides here and to some more workshop content on GitHub in the links below. So today's workshop, as I said, is about fMRI data sharing and code sharing. So I'll start off with an intro to code and data sharing and why we do it, why we think it's useful and why not. And then I'll speak a bit more about the spectrum of open data and code in the context of functional MRI. I will try to give some illustrative examples throughout and some demos, so I'll switch between the slides and some other tools quite often. Okay, so I like to tell a bit of a story. We can start with a PhD student that walks into an open science workshop, and with walk I mean sit in front of a computer. And at this workshop, the PhD student learns about transparency in science. So I really like this quote that's on the slide, which says an article about computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself, it is merely advertising of the scholarship. And the actual scholarship is the complete set of instructions and data which generated the figures or the results. So an article is just an ad to say, I published something, it's cool, great. But the actual scholarship that we should be more interested in is how did you get to that results? Which methods did you use? And can I actually follow the same methods to get to the same results? So this shifts the focus from trust me, I'm a scientist, to show me, I want to understand, query, verify, and extend. And essentially, we do not want a scenario where we publish a paper and therefore you should believe the results because it's published and we're scientists. It shouldn't be this kind of magical thing that happens in between doing the work and then seeing the results. You should be, as a scientist or researcher or a person who's interested in this work and has some training, should be able to verify all of the steps to get to the end point. And this is the whole concept of computational reproducibility. If we take the same data, if we take the same code, and if we can run it in the same environment or a similar environment, we should be able to get the same results. And for this, we need data and code sharing. So the PhD student was at the workshop, learned about all of these things, and now they're really psyched. I'm going to do all of the open science. And what do we do when we start off with a new project? We make a list. But first, maybe we should think about what are valid reasons for sharing data and code, and what are valid concerns when doing this. So in the keynote today, a lot of this was already covered. But just to check on them again, valid reasons for sharing data and code is computational reproducibility, but also the kind of incremental approach that we often hear people speak about when they say science is incremental. But how is it incremental? You need to be able to allow others to build on your work. And how do you better allow others to build on your work if you make it easy for them to implement your code, your data, your methods? Also, if you share these things, it can add to the scientific body of evidence. So in terms of making it easier for meta-analyses to be conducted. It also improves the trust in the scientific endeavor. So not show me or not trust me for whichever reason, show me, and then the trust is improved. There's a bunch of other benefits, at least in my opinion, in terms of being able to get more recognition nowadays for sharing data and code. For example, data papers that can get cited. There's more and more emphasis being put on these types of data management best practices that labs are now getting more and more used to hiring people who do that. So if you do this from the start, you can get recognized for a person as a person who does that, and maybe you can get hired. But something that I like a lot is actually just it teaches good practices that allows you to be more efficient and reduce research waste, which there's a lot of. There's also valid concerns when you share your data and your code. One of the most pertinent concerns, I think, when it comes to sharing data, especially human MRI data, is personal data privacy. So you do not want to be in a spot where you didn't take care of that and you have to pay a fine or whatever, especially nowadays when we look at the regulations of the GDPR, which are quite strict, but also quite vague, which we'll get to. There's also the fear of being ridiculed or an error of yours being found in your code, for example, which is it's not great. I mean, everyone probably has that feeling, but actually we shouldn't, because everyone makes errors, even the best or the people who are known for being good scientists or just famous. So another concern could be that you think your data or code is messy, and maybe it is, and maybe actually it would be better if the data and code were cleaned up before they were shared. One of the biggest concerns, or not concerns, but the biggest things that hinder sharing data and code, I think, is the amount of work it takes, and that's why often it gets devalued a bit and not prioritized. So we see all these valid concerns and also valid benefits to sharing data and code, and it's not an easy decision to take. You might be anxious about it, you might just not have time, but it's not easy, especially if you have to do other things. We're all scientists or researchers, we probably just have to publish papers, so we're not given the time, and the incentives don't align for us to be able to focus on these things. But I would like to suggest that we start small. So if we all say, yes, we want to increase the transparency in science, then perhaps we could start just by doing a small bit, build something into our research pipeline, and then improve on that from that point onwards. So I'll give today the whole spectrum of what I think data and code sharing is about, and let's just choose one of these things to carry on with afterwards. So the spectrum of data and code sharing, in my opinion, is from very, very simplistic to probably much more complicated. Data and code available on request, which is quite common. Then I think the first easier step is to share code, and a bit more difficult is to share data. And then after that comes computational reproducibility in terms of environments, and also much more interactive applications to explore data. So data available on request, which we all know is kind of a joke, and it is more than often probably data available or data not available on request. We also saw some evidence for that in the first keynote, where data is not being sent to people who request it, even though it was written in the article that data is available on request, or perhaps it was written data is available on reasonable request, for which we have to then ask, pretty please give me the data. But essentially, this whether the reason is the PhD student or the postdoc who collected the data is now in a different lab, or not in academia anymore, or the email is not being answered. There might be quite valid reasons for this. The problem is that it is a huge bottleneck in terms of transparency in science. So this is not an option we want to take unless you really, really, really have no other options, which I think is a difficult position to be in. But so let's start with what I think is perhaps on the easier side of sharing data and code, which is sharing code, sharing a script. There are a bunch of suggested best practices we can follow in this section, and I'll talk a bit about open source, about version control, about documenting your code, and then other steps you can take in order to share code well, and then also make it fair. What is it? Findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. I hope that's correct. Essentially, a lot of this feeds into making the shared code fair. Open source. I think one of my main motivations for trying to move more to open source is the fact that a lot of these software packages are free. So in terms of money, you don't have to pay a license fee to actually be able to use the software. And the point there is that it just makes it so much more accessible to people who do not have the money necessarily to pay. So if you write an article and you tell people, okay, you can reproduce, here's my data and my code, but then they actually need to pay money to be able to do that. That's not really transparent and reproducible. So I would suggest, if you can, opt for a free software. And if you're working in neuroimaging, I would suggest working with Python. It is a great extensible language that has so much embedded tools. Ooh, sorry about that. Where am I now? There. Already in the system. So there's a lot of neuroimage analysis tools that's already built on Python, or for which you can use Python to hook into. And it can open so much more in terms of collaborations as well. So I myself switched from MATLAB to Python a year ago. Not fully, I still do a lot of stuff in MATLAB. And before that, I was using MATLAB for a very long time. So it's really cool to switch. It's also quite complicated. Some things are just quite frustrating if you're embedded in a certain way of thinking. But you can see some of my struggles that I shared there on this Twitter thread. Python really opens up new avenues for you to use, like some of the best tools that are available in our field. And I would suggest, if you haven't started with Python yet, suggest starting quite small with an intro to Python and also Jupyter notebooks for MRI. So I added a link there. There's very likely a lot more tutorials on these things online. So I just add some links that I'm familiar with. You will see on my other slides as well. I often refer to stuff that I did before or that people I know did. And that's just a case of like proximity bias, I guess. But you will probably also find other very useful tools online. Version control is useful when sharing code. So we all know that you write a script to process data. So say you want to extract the time series of a voxel in the brain in an fMRI data set. So you have one run of data of 6 minutes, and you want to see this voxel fluctuates in this way according to a task or something. You write a script to do that, but then you change a bit, and then you add a new version, or you make it version 1, version 2. You change a thing, it exports another format, version 2.2. But then you add some more, version 2.2 for July, and then you really make the final one. And then just as you submit the article, you realize, oh, I need to change more stuff. And then it's like the final one. And we actually name it that way. I have a bunch of Word documents that look pretty similar. And this is problematic. We want to prevent this from happening. In a year's time, you're going to look back and see final 2.2.4 or whatever you have. You're not going to have a clue what this means, unless you have a great memory, in which case, great for you, but not necessarily for your collaborators. So version control can fix this. Version control, like Git, for example, which is a system that's used for version control, allows you to keep track of your changes in your code without losing previous versions, and also being able to revert back to previous versions. And you can kind of split off, stop at a certain point and then split to a different line of coding, or you want to expand some function but not the other, and you can create different functions or different scripts from it. So that's great, but it also allows you to upload it to a web platform that supports Git, for example, GitHub, and then make that public, such that others can see your code, they can download it, they can contribute to it, they can suggest changes or ask questions, log issues, etc. So it's really great for collaboration and project coordination as well. So if you want to learn more about this, there's also a link, Intro to Version Control with Git and GitHub. So I'm going to go through quickly an example of how to share a script with GitHub. So I created an example repo here, but I can quickly show you. Let's go to that link. I'm just going to go to my GitHub page first. You can see here, this is what your GitHub page looks like. There's a bunch of repositories, which is like a directory to structure all your code in per project. And you can see I created some of the repositories for today. And say we want to create a new, we want to upload a script that we wrote to plot the time series of a voxel. And this picture or figure of the time series of a voxel goes into our article. And in the article we want to say, the script for reproducing this figure can be found at link. So now we do this. We say new repository. We say hello. Well, no, let's make it more applicable. ROI, no, voxel time series. Kom nou, Stephan. Plot, and apparently this name is available. Plot some stuff is our description. We want to make it public. We also want to keep up with best practices in managing your GitHub repo. So we add a README, and I'll explain a bit more. We add a git ignore, and we choose a license. And I'm going to choose MIT for now. I'll explain a bit more later. So we create the repository. There it is. Okay, great. There's already some files there. This is the name, and that's the description. And you can see the license is there. So now we have our repository, and we can also do this and go to our file. So this is my folder where I saved my voxel time series plot, and you can see it's IPython notebook, which is a Jupyter notebook, but it could be an R script or MATLAB or Python or whatever. So I can basically just go now back to this. I can say add a file, upload files. I can grab my file and put it here. Great, so now it's there, and I can commit the changes, which just means I save it. I can write this description of what I did here, like what type of save did I do, which I'm just going to skip. I'm just going to commit it. And now in our repository, you can see the new file. If I click on it, we can view it. It renders a bit funny, but this is what it looks like. So for those of you who are not familiar with Jupyter notebooks, it's awesome, firstly, but essentially it is a way to write words, but also code and equations and plot figures all in the same document. and you can execute it in a way that it updates when you want to change the code, for example. So there you can see some words that I wrote, and then some code to import packages, Python packages that we use, and then some code to get data and to display information there, etc. So this is just some code to plot stuff, and there you can see a voxel time series. Cool. So there it is. Essentially, this now means I have my code, my script online. I can share it. I can just take this URL. I can put it in my article and say, there is the script to plot the figure. So that's already a good step. If you walk away from this workshop doing one thing and it's this, then great. That's good for open science. Then we're getting there. But you can also do more. So if I go back to the screen, we now share the script with GitHub, but we can do a bit more. So we can do licensing. What else did I list here? We can do licensing, we can document our code, give better instructions. We can also do versioning and identification. So if we talk about licensing, the main point here is that it's a good practice to put a license on your data, even if it's the least restrictive license you can get, which is pretty much the MIT license. Because if there's no license, then people actually may not use or reuse your code without asking you first. So if you want to remove that extra bottleneck and you don't want to receive emails and you just want people to use it whichever way, or you want them to give you recognition, or you want them to specifically not use it for commercial purposes, there's a whole range of licenses that you can choose from. Then you just need to put that license on there. And we already did that when we started up the repository, so that's great. We can also do versioning and put a object identifier on it. So again, for reproducibility, it's better if someone reads your code, it's better that they say, I used this code version X. For example, I think the latest revision of SPM12 is 7771. So that's good to state in your articles and methods section. It's better than saying just SPM12, because it could be a different revision where they changed something or that was different previously, and that could generate different results, but then that's not documented, and then that's not good for reproducibility. So it's a good idea to version your code. If it gets more complicated, or if it's if it's a simple script to plot a time series, then it's perhaps not that important. But what it's actually useful for, and which I suggest doing in any case, is creating a version and then putting a digital object identifier on that version, which means people can then cite your code in an easy way, and we can use Zenodo for that. I wonder if I put a link to Zenodo somewhere. No, I didn't, but I can quickly show you. I quickly open Zenodo here. So here you can see our repository, and I can create a new release. This is a different way of saying create a new version of it. So I create v1.0. Can write something about it. Usually it's very extensive for large software packages, like all the changes that happened. I can publish the release, and then I can go to Zenodo and I can actually create something like this. And I'm not going to do it right now, but I have a nice screenshot here that you can see. So this is something I created previously, and I just link to a release on GitHub, and it puts a digital object identifier on it, and you can cite this, and I can accrue citations if that's important to me. So it's really useful. I don't know why I exited the presentation now. I'll just go back in. So that's code sharing, the essence of it. I mean, it can get much more. You can share much more code. You can share a software package, and it gets complicated. But essentially, that you do the same stuff. Ooh, I forgot. I'll go back to our repo quickly, and this is the part of making your codes easier to understand. So yes, you can share, but you can also do a better job perhaps of explaining to people what the code is supposed to do. So you can do that at various levels. In the code itself, if we go, for example, to this, which now I'm using PyCharm to edit my script, and this is the actual code that's inside the Jupyter notebook. And here I could perhaps say something more like add a comment that says data is or are, whichever one you prefer, downloaded from open. I'm not great at typing in this way. From OpenNeuro. So this maybe explains to people where this data actually comes from. So I am saying this because documenting your code is useful for you, for future you, for your collaborators, for so many people. So please do that. You can also improve the understandability of your code by actually selecting useful variable names, so not something like A, B, C, X, Y, Z, or whatever, or BB or BB1 or 2 or whatever. Like calling it something that people might recognize. So subject directory, functional nifty, that's zipped, structural nifty, that's zipped, something like that. Perhaps we can even improve upon my way of doing it. So that's useful, but also on the level of your repository, you can improve this. You can, what's happening here? That shouldn't happen. Something with the, it's with the version. I don't want to go to the version, I just want to go to master. So, sorry, this is supposed to be fine, yes. So I can also write more useful information here. So I said here plot some stuff, but this is not what you want people to read. You want to tell them this repo contains code to reproduce the figure X from article, include citation. In order to run this, you need, and then you list all the stuff that the people need to do to run it and to get the same thing. So you can explain in much more detail what people should or can do to reproduce your results. So that's what I mean in terms of improving documentation of your code. So now getting back to the slides. This is a checklist that you can follow, you can add to. It's not exhaustive necessarily, but it contains the what I think are the basics and the useful basics. So use version control, try to write clean, well-documented code, upload it to a public repository. I showed GitHub, but you can also do GitLab or Bitbucket or some others. And describe how people should run your code in the README. You can add a license with different levels of restriction or allowances, and you can make it citable. And then if your software, if the script that you upload becomes a software package or something more, you can also add things like contributor guidelines or code of conduct. And you can also perhaps write a software paper to get some more citations. It's all about them citations. And there I added a link to the Journal of Open Source Software, which looks really cool, and I hope to be able to publish something there soon. So now we're going over to data. And you can see Galaxy Brain is becoming increasingly intense, which is great. Data sharing is a bit more difficult. And here we'll cover things like ethics, data privacy, describing the data, which we'll also do with the code, using standardized data structures, putting in a repository, which we'll also do with code, and also looking at licensing and sharing it at different stages of analysis. So ethics and personal data privacy is important because we're dealing with personal data when it comes to human MRI. And my suggestions there is, well, firstly, you should also always gather acquire the ethical approval that you need, or get a waiver if you don't need it, and start very early. So if you can, before you collect the data, long before you collect the data. I mean, there's a lot of existing data sets that you cannot do that anymore, but there are other ways of perhaps still being able to share that data, but let's start early. Also ensure as we're in the Netherlands, ensure that your data collection and the processing and the sharing of that conforms to the GDPR principles. So have a look at things like informed consent, what information is included there, whether you consider some aspects of the data personal, anonymous, or pseudo-anonymous or pseudonymous. And there's a lot of anonymization procedures that you should apply. And then also getting approval from your data protection officer. I also suggest speaking to your data protection officer like very early in the process, similar to what you should do with your ethical protocol. And it's about setting up the right documentation and process and agreeing on the principles according to which you'll not only collect or process the data, but also according to which you'll share the data. And this is I mean, in my small bubble of a world, it's a hot topic at the moment, like sharing versus GDPR when it comes to brain research data. And it's really complicated, and people also disagree. The GDPR can be quite vague. We've spent some time on this in the past year or more, having some discussions and having a hackathon about it, and everywhere people are discussing this. So I gave a recent talk that's linked here that you can view on YouTube, and you can also have a look at what we're doing with the Open Brain Consent working group. We have a preprint out from a month ago or so to update on what's going on there, and it's essentially working together to make getting consent for sharing brain data easier, and also now including GDPR regulations into that process. And I'm happy to discuss this with anyone if you're more interested. So I'm not going to go into the details here, but you should share ethically and according to principles that keep the personal data privacy paramount of your participants. There's a lot of P's in there. So say you have ethical approval, and you also have approval from your data protection officer to be able to share it, and consent from your data participants. Then we want to describe our data well before we share it. So a simple example here is we don't like data that's where the columns, for example, are not named, and also where the name of the actual file, this should be a TSV, not a CSV, sorry, where the name of the actual file is not descriptive. So file name should be descriptive, the data inside should be descriptive. For example, this has headings ROI 1, 2, 3, etc. So this is essentially the intensity of some voxels or region of interest of an ROI over time. So describe your data well, but also on a meta level, describe, for example, in a README or a thing that people read when you publish the data somewhere. Describe it well. I'll explain a bit more what I mean with that shortly. And this includes descriptions of what the data looks like, also how to extract the data from the format that you publish it in, which tools to use, etc. So I have an example here of also a data set, and I just randomly found this, or arbitrarily, a data set of COVID data from the New York Times on GitHub, and you can see here the README is quite extensive. They give some new updates up top there, but they explain what it is, what's the difference between live and historical data, and then they give some use cases here, and they say, okay, what's the column names, and what does it look like, and they also give some at the bottom. Let me see here. What you can do for licensing and attribution of this dataset, and how to contact them, and who are the contributors. So it's nicely documented. If you read this, you probably will know a lot more about the data and be more ready to start using it. Oops. Yeah, so that's describing your data well. It's a general principle. Try to describe it in a way that makes it more fair for people to use. When it comes to structuring your data, BIDS is the thing you want to do. Brain Imaging Data Structure. So it's a community-maintained standard for naming and organizing neuroimaging data. And it's been in existence, I don't know, for years already. And it's quickly expanding to include different modalities of MRI data, but also, different types of MRI data, but also different modalities, EEG, ECOG, MEG. So it's really great, and it just gives you a nice feeling when you organize your data into bits format. There's a lot of converters available, so pipelines or applications that take your DICOM data, put it into bits format. Something that's really great is if you put your data into a standardized structure, then programs can understand that structure, and they can automate processes based on that structure. And this is what also is called BIDS apps. A lot of people have built great pipelines that you run from a BIDS pipeline. So this means if you organize your data properly, you get access to so much more pipelines, and you don't have to build these things yourself. You just have to structure your data nicely, and that to me is awesome. You might have heard of things like MRIQC, SPM. What's the other thing? That's fMRI prep. So a lot of these things you can use more easily if you structure your data into bits format. There's a bits starter kit, which is a set of. Let me just do this. Set of useful instructions and videos and tutorials and references to resources to help you get started with BIDS and your dataset. And there's also a video that from the recent OHBM hackathon that tells you about the benefits of BIDS, and just a visual representation of what BIDS looks like. So you have your DICOM data, and you push it through a converter, or you can manually convert if you want, and then it's like this. So you have your dataset with a file that includes the names of all the participants. Subject 1 has anatomical data, functional data, diffusion weighted imaging data, and then all the names of the files inside there in a standard naming convention. And this has been compared to being BIDS being the Mary Kondo of neuroimaging, and I pretty much agree with that. Like really, BIDS dataset sparks joy, and anything else is just extremely frustrating. It's extremely frustrating for yourself in a few months' time when you try to figure out what did I do with this dataset. It's extremely frustrating for your collaborators, even people in your own group, if your data is not well structured. So BIDS, please do this. I said if there's one thing you walk away with, it's you can upload your script to GitHub, but maybe you walk away with two things, and that's also please structure your data in the BIDS format. So your data is structured, your data is described. Now we want to upload it, and there's a bunch of repositories that we can find useful in this regard. The first thing that comes to mind is OpenNeuro. So OpenNeuro is a free open platform for MRI, MEG, EEG, EEG, and ECOG data, and it's being extended. BIDS is being extended a lot, so it might have some other modalities listed there, so other types of MRI data as well. And this is a place for raw MRI data. So I can show you quickly what it looks like. Probably some of you or a lot of you might be familiar with this. There's OpenNeuro. There's a public dashboard. There are so many datasets. All of these are datasets. So if I just choose which one, let's do this. There's the name, people who updated it or uploaded it. There's an option to download it. This is what it looks like, the size, how many subjects, sessions, etc. Here you can see the actual data. There's subject 1, anatomical, and there's MAG. Everything according to the bits structure. There's some instructions or some methods, essentially the README, the DOI, so you can cite it, type of license. Great, this allows everything that we talked about. And you can also download it. If you say download, I can download it directly to my browser. I can also download it automatically from Amazon S3 bucket, or not automatically, via command line interface, and which is quite useful. So OpenNeuro is great. If you are not able to share your data on OpenNeuro for different reasons, so maybe you cannot share your raw data, but maybe also your data protection officer is concerned about OpenNeuro from a GDPR perspective, which there's a lot of people sitting on the fence or on either side of the fence of this discussion. So say you're on the side where you're not allowed to share your data on OpenNeuro because it's US based or for other reasons. You can still share, and mostly those reasons would be that it's still considered personal data. You might share data that is considered non-personal data, and you can very likely consider statistical maps in a standard space to be non-personal data. So you can share your statistical maps. It's still great if you do that. People can still use your statistical maps added to a big data set that can be meta and analyzed, or they can use your statistical maps to generate the figures that you add to your article. So sharing is useful wherever you do it in the pipeline of your data. And for that we can use NeuroVault. I'm not going to demo it now, but you can click on it and do that. Come now. There's other repositories as well. Zenodo, Fixture, they're quite famous. All with different levels of access or restrictions or openness or whatever the state of sharing. There's also something that I want to highlight, which is country specific. So in the Netherlands we have DataverseNL, and this, in my experience, pretty much gives you what you would need to share a BIDS fMRI dataset. It doesn't give you the same interface as OpenNeuro does, because OpenNeuro is just great in that way, and we don't have country-specific things like that. The closest we do get is the donors repository, at least in my experience. So if you're a student or a professor or a researcher at the donors, Stephan, at the Donors Institute, you can do something like this. So you also structure your data in the BIDS format, but then it's listed in a way that they set up their repository. So there's a study with authors and contributors, etc. Yeah, there's a description, metadata, files, and here you can see a similar structure. So all the subjects, and inside the subjects you can see anatomical, DWI, func, meg. So it's still BIDS, it's just ordered in a different way, and they have different levels of access that you can also apply. So Dataverse.nl doesn't give you that granularity in terms of structuring data and making it visible to people without being able to download it, but it does give you something that allows GDPR compliance as far as I personally understand it, which is not necessarily exhaustive or indicative of what it should be. But you can add a data user agreement. You can limit the amount of people, or you can limit the access that people have. You can set access levels, collaborators, or just people who view it, or people who cannot see it at all. You can add a data user agreement, which we tend to suggest for GDPR purposes. And they have to agree to those terms before they are able to download it. So this is what you can do with a BITS dataset if you're in the Netherlands and you don't have a institute-specific solution. Great. So I covered data repositories. And then we're getting to a data sharing checklist. So get ethics approval. Do not conduct unethical research, please. Also, do not conduct research or share data that does not adhere to the GDPR. And I know there are different interpretations, but you have to basically put in the time, or you have to work with people who have put in the time to understand this in a useful way. And you have to be able to defend the decisions that have made, or at least your data protection officer has to. So adhere to the GDPR. So basically just keep the data privacy of the individuals as a very, very high priority. Data should be structured clearly according to standard, and that standard is BIDS. And data descriptions, metadata, yes. Save it to a repository. You can add a license for use or not, if that is a sensible thing to be able to do. And it's there's a big discussion around like the differences and agreements between licensing, copyright, copyleft, and the GDPR regulations that I am too uneducated to comment on. It's nice to be able to create a citable version of your data, and then also consider publishing a data paper. For example, this data note, but there's other options in different journals as well. Okay, so now we're exploding the brain a bit more on the left-hand side with reproducible environments. We can share our code, we can share our data, but can we get people to actually run everything in a way that works, to be able to take the data, process it with a script or with the whole pipeline that we built, and then get the same results. And this is where reproducible environments comes in. And it basically serves to address the well, it worked on my computer problem. And that shouldn't be our excuse. We should be able to use the current technology to help us to get something to work easily for people somewhere at the other side of the world as well, without them having to install loads and loads of stuff. Like, it can get really complicated to manage your software and software packages, as this graphic quite funnily shows, but also quite accurately. And I also experienced this with the first time working with Python. Like, I just still don't know how most of these things work, like how they're intertwined. But we need to get to a system that allows people to reproduce our work. I want to focus a bit on Binder in that sense, but there's also a lot of options here. There's things like Conda for software and version management. There's containers like Docker and Singularity. And then there's something like Binder, which I like and which I'll talk a bit more about. So if we talk about reproducible environments, there's a whole range of different scenarios, but you can talk about command line interfaces, which is often something like Conda or something like containers. And then you can also talk a bit more about graphical interfaces, which we can say Binder and virtual machines are. And you can reproduce only the software and the versions and the packages. And Conda and Binder are examples of that. But you can also reproduce a whole system. Like on my Mac, I could run some Windows system if I use a container or a virtual machine, for example. If you want to learn more about it, I added some links to tutorials there. And thanks Rachel Ainsworth for that I could reuse this graph. And one of these tutorials is also by Dr. Ainsworth, and I would definitely suggest going through that. It's really useful. So Binder is described well by this graphic here by Juliet Taka. Essentially, Jane has written a paper based on her experiments. She would like anyone to be able to reproduce that. She describes her experiment in the Jupyter notebook that I showed previously. That's got code and some descriptions and some pictures. And she wants to publish them for people to be able to reuse that. So she published them on GitHub. We've covered these things. But now we get to a point where she also wants to make that binder ready by describing the software required to run in the notebook. So you can describe that in the README, and then you can let other people care about that, installing that on their system. But you can describe it in such a way for Binder to understand, and then Binder automatically creates that environment for you. And now everyone can run that. And that's just so awesome. It blew my mind. It's still blowing my mind. So you put your code on GitHub, you add a Binder configuration, and you point Binder to that repo, and then everything just happens. I will show you. So it's easy to work with Binder with open source languages like Python or Julia Octave, but I've written lots of MATLAB scripts that I've also gotten to work because MATLAB is pretty much the same syntax as Octave, and SPM12, for example, is open sourced, and there's Octave versions of that, so I can do SPM12 neuroimaging analysis in a Binder environment. And that is tutorial 2 that I wrote that you can have a look at. There's a bunch of links here, but I'll quickly start with the Binder setup. I forgot I should actually have started this up a while back already. So just give me a second, because Binder just takes some time to start up. So I'm quickly gonna click on this one. So you can see here there's the notebook that we shared previously, all the stuff that we created, but I previously created this repository with some content. So this link to the slides, and here's the Binder environment. So I'm going to launch it and then get back to describing what we do here. So we said we need to add some configuration files for Binder, and then we also need to point Binder to this repository. So the configuration file that I added is this requirements and the post-build file. Requirements is a list of names of the packages, the Python packages that need to be installed for people to be able to run that notebook that we created. So in your previously, if you don't use Binder, you would just write in the README, you have to install these packages, and then you can run the code. But now we tell Binder, please install these packages. So that's the requirements.txt file. And there's also post-build, which you can or cannot use, or don't have to. But in this case, the post-build tells Binder to also download some data. And this is data from OpenNeuro. So it's just a one-liner command line that says, please download this specific data from OpenNeuro, and then put it where it can be accessed. And the Binder is ready. So what I also show here is this is what my Binder looks like. So mybinder.org. It says turn a GitHub repo into a collection of interactive notebooks. Great. So I just go to my repository that we just added all of those things now. There's my notebook that people want to reproduce. There's the post-build, there's the requirements. And I just take this link, I go to Binder, and I put it there, and I say launch. And then it starts doing stuff. Already built, launching. Great. So because it's already built, it's easier, but usually it shows a bit of logs here to say it's now doing this, installing the package, etc., etc. Anyways, so now it shows us that. Great. I'm going to close this one. I also want to open another one quickly just to show you, or just start opening it while I'm explaining the other one. So launch Binder. Now I'm going to go back to our code that we shared. This is opening up a Jupyter Notebook environment. There's the data that was downloaded, anatomical and functional data, and there's the Jupyter Notebook. So I can open it, and this is happening right now in the browser and running in the cloud somewhere, and anyone can do this. So this is not because of some local installation of packages on my system. So now I'm going to run it. On a Mac, I can press Shift Enter to run all the different cells. It imports packages. I locate the data. Then I load the structural information, structural image, and I print some header information from the Nifty. That's what the header information looks like. Then we plot some stuff. There might be a warning. Yes, there's a warning, but let's not care about the warning. I don't know what it means, or haven't read it. But I can essentially now scroll through my Nifty image, which is cool. It's just a bit delayed. I can change to summer. Okay, great. So that works. And then we say, let's load the functional data, and then we plot the voxel time series. Great. So now, without having to do anything except for clicking on a button, someone across the globe has reproduced our results, and that should make everyone smile. Okay, great. This one is also loaded. So this one is the binder or the setup that I built for using Octave with SPM in a Jupyter notebook. I wrote a tutorial about this if you're interested. But this is just to show that you don't have to, you're not restricted to using binder only if you use Python. You can also do it with MATLAB and SPM code. It's just a bit of setup that's important, but here you can see I write MATLAB code. It prints a picture, and there's some fMRI stuff. So there I'm also plotting things with just a standard subplot in MATLAB. Plotting functional data. Yeah, so you can do the same stuff. That's great. Now going back to Binder. This is reproducible environments. So Binder is great. You can also use containers to achieve similar things, but I'm summarizing now for brevity. I mean, it's more complicated underneath. But yes, but there's also other tools that you can use. So there's BrainLife.io, and there's links to the app, but also to a talk on that. There's also CodeOcean. And a tutorial with MATLAB, SPM12, and fMRI data, which I wrote for CodeOcean that you can check out. So there are different solutions. I just personally like Binder. I don't know why, because it's awesome. BrainLife.io is actually very extensive in the sense that you can share your code and people can share their pipelines there, and you can run so much neuroscience analysis on this. And there's really interesting stuff that people have done. It's similar. I think I haven't used it. I've played around with it a bit, so I might be misrepresenting it a bit. But some of these apps, I would say, are similar to BIDS apps. So you create a pipeline that you work on that can run on data and can achieve some output, and then you just save that app here, and other people can access it too and run the same pipelines. And because BIDS data is structured so standardly or in a standard way, then things are just so much more easy. Okay, so reproducible environments, and then we go to like Galaxy Brain, the ultimate, which is interactive data exploration. So we have shared our data, we have shared our code, or the other way around. There's a script to reproduce something. Great. Now there's data from which you can run the script to reproduce something. Great. Now there's a now there's a reproducible environment which says you don't have to install anything, just click on this button that downloads the data, that has the script, and you can just run everything, and you can play around with the code, you can change it as well, and reproduce the results. And what's the next step? So in my opinion, that's interactive data exploration. And the essence here is, so we've seen a Jupyter notebook, which you can mix code and data and visualizations and explanations, and that's a great setup for an article. But we still use PDFs. So what if we move away from that traditional way of presenting our scientific results? Why do we use PDFs in the first place? It's quite restrictive, and we have all of these great technologies available, and it's well described, and people actually use it in science in our own field a lot, but it's not pervasive yet, so it's probably a bit quite niche still. So why are we not doing this? And this is quite frustrating once you get to learn more and more about this, because there are so many great opportunities with these type of tools. So I think that's the next frontier in terms of open data and code, is interactive data exploration. So the idea here, what I'm getting at, is to build an app or a website that goes along with your publication, or that could be the publication, where people can see the scripts, they can see the data, but they can also like explore the data in an interactive way that's allowed with current technologies. And a tool to be able to do something like that is Dash by Plotly. And I don't know if you know Plotly, but Plotly is a library to essentially have all of these interactive figures, and you can search it a bit. So Dash is then a way to build, based on Python, to build interactive web apps that use Plotly graphs, for example. So something like this. I think somewhere they call it here, most downloaded trusted framework for building machine learning and data science web apps. And it really allows all of this interactivity with drop downs and figures and hover and click actions and all of the stuff that makes someone like me very excited. You can go to the Dash Gallery to explore some apps. There's some stuff on brain data as well. I think there's a nice one. Brain Surface Viewer. Taking a bit of time to load, but essentially there's some cool stuff you can do if you work with Dash. But so firstly, you need some skills in terms of programming to be able to build this. But if we move towards a scenario where we do more collaborative science and team science, where someone in the team has these skills and then collaborates with the rest of the people, all bring their own skills to the team, this could be great. And I'm kind of envisioning a system where if you publish something, it's not a PDF, it's a living entity, and it gets added to and contributed to over time. It's software mixed with descriptions, mixed with equations, mixed with code, and interactive visualizations, which is great. So I'm going to show you something I built with Dash by Plotly, and I don't use all of the extensive things that you can do. It's a few basic things, but I really like it. It's for a methods review, so it's not even very particular necessarily to brain research data. But this goes along with a recent publication of mine and my collaborators, where we look at neurofeedback methods, and this allows you to explore the data that I actually collected and coded for that methods review. So you can browse the data, it's a bunch of articles that's listed, and then it's coded for some methods, specifically quality control and denoising practice that they did. And you can filter on this. I can say, let's say 7 Tesla. It goes to the articles there. I can see what other steps I did, etc. I can also go here to visualize, and I can go and say for the different vendors, which software did they choose. So for the articles that were reported, let's say they used GE, what type of software did they use? For Philips, what type of software? So there's interactive aspect, and if you click on this, for example, I can go below and list all of these articles. I can go to the DOI, I can open it up, and then it goes there to the article. So this is so much more easy to work with and understandable to work with than an Excel that I could have also added, that I did add. as supplementary material. So that's what I'm getting at with interactive and visualizations and apps and that. And something else that I'm working on now, which I also want to show, I'm wondering if it's running at the moment. I think it's this one, yeah. It's not finished yet, it's not shared yet, so if you see some weird stuff going on, just forgive me. But it's also a similar app, but then also containing brain research data. So I'm into methods and also studying multi-echo. So I'm working with real-time multi-echo fMRI, and essentially this is the interactive visualization data exploring app that I want to share along with the data and along with the publication. So for example, if we look at the quality of the data that I want to report, I want to see head movement. So in terms of frame-wise displacement, I can go to all the participants and I can click this one moved a lot, for example, and okay, this is the different tasks they did, and in the last one they moved a lot, and others a bit less, and I can see the frame-wise displacement as it goes, like spikes every now and then, but for example for someone who moved less, the frame-wise displacement trace is really like chilled. So that's great. I can also plot figures. I can say like, there's a nice plot of TSNR, temporal signal to noise ratio for the different subjects. I can go between different runs. I segmented it into different tissue types. I can remove one of the plots and add them back. So these are all plotly figures. That's great. You can scroll. So this interactivity is so great, and especially if you compare it to something like a static figure in a PDF. And a static figure shows so much less than what the data is actually all about. You can show statistical maps. You can show plots like that. You can show subject physiology. There's so many things that you can show that I like. And it allows you to really understand the data more in a global way and also on a very specific way compared to other subjects or compared to other measures. So that's Dash by Plotly, and I think this gets at this interactive data exploration. So this also brings me to the end. So data and code available on request? Nope. Code shared? Yes, great. Data shared as well? Even more so. Reproducible environment, that's great. And then building up to this level where we use the tools available to build great scientific outputs that more people can get access to, more people can understand, interact with, and maybe get inspired by. That's what I think we're all about. So take home messages. I think if you're new to all of this, if you're new to open science or maybe new to these tools, you might be like, okay, let's just take a step back because this is too much. I don't know what. It's a bit crazy. And I can totally understand it. Sometimes still feel like that. But I want to say that there's this whole spectrum of open data and code. But I don't think we should implement all of them at once or go crazy or just freak out and try to learn all the tools. And I say that from my experience. Don't do it. So I would suggest start small and start, for example, by sharing the script to reproduce the results or the figures in your next poster or your next script. If you already do that and you want to do more, share the data, share the codes, share reproducible environments. And I think another thing that I would like to emphasize is to try and start early with best practices, not necessarily with the tools and the things to share immediately, but like using version control and structuring your data according to BIDS format. These are two great practices that I think if you do start to do them, the rest will follow kind of organically. You will just start sharing data on GitHub because sharing your scripts and code and software, and you will interact and collaborate with people because that's just now part of your workflow. And the same with bids. You will use these bids apps because now you can do it because it's structured accordingly. So even if your repositories are private, or even if you don't want to share your data, I would still suggest using these best practices. And then once you're more familiar, I would suggest then branching out and creating a reproducible environment with Python or maybe start building a Dash app. So thank you for listening. Please feel free to ask questions or mail or send me or connect with me on Twitter. And it was so great. So thanks again for the organizers for doing this.